Greed has a funny way of turning the brother you grew up with into a ruthless stranger. When Simon stood before the judge, passionately demanding I be locked away for stealing our father's manufacturing empire, I didn't bother arguing. I simply waited for the courtroom projector to power on. To understand how my own flesh and blood could try to send me to federal prison, you have to understand the empire our father built, and the shadow it cast over both of us. My father, Richard Fletcher, started Fletcher Precision Components in a rusted-out garage in Dayton, Ohio, in 1982. By the time I was in high school, it was a $100 million manufacturing firm producing high-tolerance titanium parts for commercial airlines and defense contractors. My father was a man of the old world. He had permanent grease under his fingernails, drank his coffee black, and believed that respect was earned on the factory floor, not in a boardroom. My older brother, Simon, disagreed. Simon was the golden child. He was 5 years older, tall, charismatic, and possessed a smile that could disarm a hostile union rep in 30 seconds. While I was spending my summers sweeping aluminum shavings off the shop floor and learning how to calibrate CNC machines, Simon was away at a private boarding school, followed by an Ivy League university where he majored in finance. When he finally joined the family business, he didn't ask for a desk. He demanded an executive suite. Dad gave him the title of Vice President of Business Development. It was a role Simon interpreted as taking clients to expensive steakhouses, playing golf on Tuesdays, and expensing lavish trips to scout European markets. I, on the other hand, took the path my father laid out. After a state college degree in mechanical engineering, I started as a shift supervisor. I worked my way up to floor manager, then director of operations, and finally, chief operating officer. I knew the name of every machinist, understood the supply chain bottlenecks, and could hear when a milling machine was a fraction of a millimeter out of alignment just by the pitch of its whine. I was the grunt. Simon was the face. For a long time, the arrangement worked. Dad ran the ship, I kept the engines burning, and Simon sold the tickets. But empires are fragile things, especially when the emperor falls ill. It started with a persistent cough that Dad couldn't shake. Within 2 months, the doctors delivered the diagnosis: Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was grim. 6 months if we were lucky. The dynamic in the family shifted overnight. While I spent my evenings sitting by Dad's bedside in his sprawling estate on Oakwood Avenue, reading him the daily production reports to keep his mind off the pain, Simon was conspicuously absent. He claimed he was working double time to keep the clients from panicking, but our CFO, Sarah Jenkins, quietly pulled me aside one afternoon. She showed me expense reports indicating Simon was spending an alarming amount of time meeting with rival manufacturing firms and private equity groups. He wasn't keeping the clients calm. He was shopping the company around. He was looking for an exit strategy, eager to cash out the moment the old man took his last breath. I never told Dad. I didn't want to break his heart in his final days, but Dad was much sharper than either of us gave him credit for. 3 weeks before he passed, Dad called me into his home office. He looked frail, his skin paper-thin and yellowed from the failing liver, but his eyes were as piercing as ever. He asked me to close the heavy mahogany doors and lock them. "Daniel," he rasped, struggling to sit up in his leather armchair. "I know what Simon is doing. I know about the meetings with the Sterling Group." I froze. "Dad, how? I built a company from scrap metal, Danny. You think I don't know when my own son is trying to sell it for parts?" He coughed, a deep, rattling sound. "Simon thinks this business is an ATM. He doesn't care about the 300 families whose mortgages depend on those factory jobs. He's going to gut it take his payout, and let the vultures pick the bones. He then slid a thick manila envelope across the desk. I had Arthur rewrite the will, Dad said, referring to Arthur Pendleton, our long-time family attorney. I am leaving 60% of the voting shares and the absolute position of CEO to you. Simon will receive 40%, but his shares are restricted. He cannot force a sale without your consent. The company is yours, Daniel. Protect it. I was stunned. I had always assumed Dad would split it down the middle, or perhaps even leave Simon in charge because he was the eldest. Dad, Simon is going to lose his mind. He'll tear the family apart. He's already torn it apart, Dad whispered, closing his eyes. You just have to survive the fallout. Dad passed away on a rainy Tuesday in late October. The funeral was a massive affair, attended by local politicians, industry titans, and hundreds of our workers. Simon gave a eulogy that belonged in an Oscar-winning film, complete with perfectly timed tears and dramatic pauses. He spoke about his inseparable bond with our father and his pledge to lead Fletcher Precision into the future. I sat in the front pew, staring at the polished oak casket, feeling a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. 2 days later, we sat in Arthur Pendleton's downtown office for the reading of the will. When Arthur read the clauses regarding the distribution of shares and the immediate transfer of the CEO title to me, the temperature in the room plummeted. Simon sat perfectly still for about 10 seconds. Then the charming mask cracked, revealing something incredibly ugly underneath. He didn't yell. He just leaned forward, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "You think this is going to stand, you little grease monkey?" Simon sneered, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at me. "You think you can manipulate a dying, medicated old man into signing over my birthright, and I'm just going to roll over." "Simon, these were his wishes," Arthur intervened calmly. "He was entirely lucid when we drafted this." Simon stood up, knocking his chair backward. "We'll see about that. You haven't won anything, Danny. Enjoy the big chair while you can. By the time I'm done with you, you'll be sweeping floors for minimum wage." He stormed out, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. The war had officially begun. For the first month, I braced for impact. I took over the CEO office, promoted Sarah Jenkins to Vice President of Finance, and focused entirely on stabilizing the workforce. Rumors of Dad's death had naturally spooked some of our bigger aerospace clients, and I had to fly out to Seattle and Chicago to personally guarantee that our supply chains wouldn't miss a beat. We hit our quarterly targets, the factory was humming, and for a brief, naive moment, I thought Simon had realized he was beaten. I should have known better. Simon wasn't retreating. He was digging trenches. The ambush came the week before Thanksgiving. I was in a meeting with the floor foreman when the receptionist buzzed in, her voice trembling. "Mr. Fletcher? There are some men here. Men in suits. They say they have court orders." I walked out to the lobby to find 3 aggressive-looking attorneys, flanked by 2 armed sheriff's deputies. At the center of the group stood my brother, arms crossed, wearing a smirk that made my blood boil. One of the attorneys, a shark in a pinstripe suit named Thomas Sterling, stepped forward and handed me a stack of legal documents as thick as a phone book. "Daniel Fletcher," Sterling announced loudly, ensuring everyone in the lobby could hear. "You are hereby served. We have filed an emergency injunction to freeze all company assets, pending an investigation into corporate espionage, grand larceny, and the forgery of Richard Fletcher's final will and testament." "Forgery?" I laughed, though panic was starting to claw at my throat. "Arthur Pendleton drafted that will himself." Simon stepped forward, looking around at the wide-eyed employees. "Arthur drafted a will, yes. But the document you submitted to probate? The one with Dad's signature? We have expert testimony stating that signature is a blatant forgery. More importantly, Danny. Simon leaned in close, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. We know about the money you've been stealing. The injunction was a nightmare. The judge, swayed by a mountain of evidence Simon's legal team had dumped on the court, granted a temporary freeze on all of my executive powers. An independent receiver was appointed to oversee the company's finances while the lawsuit proceeded. Worse, my personal assets were frozen. I immediately hired Rebecca Hayes, a brilliant, no-nonsense litigator who charged by the minute and didn't suffer fools. We sat in her conference room, going over the discovery documents Simon's team had provided. What I saw made me physically sick. Simon hadn't just claimed the will was forged. He had hired a forensic accountant, Greg Harrison, who produced a damning 50-page report. According to the report, over the last 2 years of Dad's life, while I was COO, exactly $3.2 million had been siphoned out of the company's equipment maintenance budget and routed to offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. The name on the shell company's registry? D. Fletcher Holdings. This is insane, I told Rebecca, staring at the bank statements. I didn't authorize these transfers. I don't even have a passport, let alone an offshore account. Simon set this up. He had access to the financials, too. He framed me. Rebecca pushed her glasses up her nose. I believe you, Daniel. But belief doesn't win in court. Paperwork does. Right now, the paperwork says you had direct oversight of the maintenance budget, and your initials are on the internal transfer authorizations. He forged my initials. Can you prove it? She asked flatly. Because right now, Simon has a handwriting expert willing to swear those initials are yours. He also has a witness, a night nurse, who took care of your father in his final weeks. She gave a sworn deposition, stating she heard you screaming at your father, demanding he change the will, and that you locked her out of the room. I felt the room spin. The night nurse, Maria. I remembered her. I had never screamed at Dad, but I had once asked her to step out of the room to give Dad and me some privacy to talk about the company. Simon had obviously paid her off or intimidated her into twisting the memory. The narrative Simon was spinning was brutally effective. I was the jealous, underappreciated younger brother who realized I was going to be passed over for the top job. In retaliation, I embezzled millions to build a golden parachute, and when Dad found out, I coerced and bullied him on his deathbed into signing a forged will, cutting Simon out of his rightful inheritance. The trial date was set for early March. For 3 months, I lived in hell. The local business journals published scandalous articles about the Fletcher family feud. Some of my oldest friends in the industry stopped returning my calls. I had to take out a second mortgage on my house just to pay Rebecca's retainer. Through it all, the factory suffered under the court-appointed receiver, who didn't understand the first thing about aerospace manufacturing. Morale plummeted. Deadlines were missed. Simon's prophecy was coming true. The company was bleeding to death. 2 weeks before the trial, I hit rock bottom. I was sitting alone in Dad's old home office at the Oakwood estate, which I had inherited, much to Simon's fury, drinking scotch and staring at the heavy mahogany bookshelf. I remembered the day Dad handed me the real will. The company is yours, Daniel. Protect it. I'm trying, Dad, I whispered to the empty room. But he outplayed me. He fabricated a reality I can't disprove. I stood up to pour another drink, my eyes scanning the room. My gaze drifted to the ornate crown, moulding near the ceiling, specifically a dark, circular ventilation grate in the corner. Suddenly, a memory slammed into me. It was from 5 years ago. Dad and I were in this exact room. We had recently caught a cleaning service employee stealing silverware. Dad, always protective of his sanctuary, had brought in Michael Ross, our head of corporate security, to upgrade the house's alarm system. "I want eyes in here, Mike," Dad had said, "but I don't want it looking like a bank vault. Hide it." My heart hammered against my ribs. I practically climbed onto the leather sofa, reaching up toward the ventilation grate. I pulled out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and shined it through the slats. Deep inside the ductwork, glinting in the light, was the unmistakable glass lens of a micro camera. It was positioned perfectly to capture the entire room, including Dad's desk and the safe behind the bookshelf. At 2 a.m., I was aggressively pounding on Michael Ross's front door. When the burly security chief finally answered, looking groggy in his bathrobe, I didn't apologize for the hour. "Mike," I said, out of breath. "The camera in Dad's home office, the hidden one. Does it record locally, or does it feed somewhere?" Mike blinked, rubbing his eyes. It feeds to an encrypted server box locked in the basement utility closet at the Oakwood house. Kept a rolling 30-day backup. But when your old man passed, the server just kept running, storing whatever it had until the drive filled up. Why? "Grab your laptop," I told him, a fierce, manic hope igniting in my chest. "We're going hunting." The basement of the Oakwood house smelled of damp earth and old cardboard. Michael Ross and I stood before a heavy steel door tucked behind the wine cellar. My hands were shaking so badly, I dropped the keys twice before finally sliding the heavy brass tumbler open. Inside, humming quietly in the cool, climate-controlled air, was a locked server rack. It was covered in a thin layer of dust, completely untouched since Dad's passing. Michael hooked up his ruggedized laptop, his thick fingers flying across the keyboard to bypass the dormant firewall. "The system is air-gapped," Michael muttered, his eyes glued to the screen. "No Wi-Fi, no external network connection. If Simon wanted to wipe this, he would have had to physically come down here and smash the drives. He probably didn't even know this existed." "Dad didn't trust the cloud," I whispered, the memory of my father's technological paranoia bringing a tight, painful smile to my face. "He said if you can't touch the metal, you don't own the data." "All right, I'm in," Michael announced. The screen populated with hundreds of thumbnail files, meticulously time-stamped. "The drives are full. The system stopped recording about a week after the funeral. What dates are we looking for?" "Greg Harrison's forensic report," I said, pulling the folded document from my jacket pocket. "Simon claims I forged the will on October 14th, 2 weeks before Dad died. He also claims the final offshore transfer to the Cayman account happened on October 12th. Let's start there." We spent the next 6 hours sitting on overturned plastic crates, staring at the grainy, black and white infrared footage and the crisp, full-color daytime feeds. Watching my father slowly deteriorate on screen was a fresh kind of torture. I saw myself bringing him soup, reading the production logs and adjusting his blankets, but I had to push the grief down. I was looking for a ghost. At 3:14 a.m. on October 12th, we found him. The screen showed the heavy mahogany doors of Dad's office slowly swinging open. The motion-activated color camera kicked in. Into the frame stepped Simon. He wasn't wearing his usual tailored suit. He was in dark jeans and a black hoodie, looking over his shoulder. He crept over to Dad's desk and pulled a small encrypted thumb drive from his pocket. He inserted it into Dad's desktop computer. "Turn up the audio," I hissed, leaning so close to the monitor, my nose almost touched the glass. Michael cranked the volume. The room's sensitive acoustic microphones picked up the click-clack of the keyboard. Simon was on the phone, holding the device on speaker as he typed. "The routing numbers are confirmed. a voice crackled through Simon's phone. It was Thomas Sterling, his shark of an attorney. "Are you sure the old man's logins still work?" "He never changes them," Simon's voice echoed in the silent office. "I'm initiating the final $3 million wire to the D. Fletcher Holdings account now. That brings the total to just over $3 million, enough to trigger a federal grand jury if Danny ever tries to fight me for the company." "And the signature for the authorizations?" Sterling asked. On the video, Simon opened the bottom drawer of Dad's desk. He pulled out a stack of internal transfer request forms. Then he reached into his own pocket and produced a custom-made rubber stamp. He pressed it onto an ink pad and stamped the bottom of the forms. "I had a guy in Chicago fabricate a stamp of Danny's initials," Simon chuckled, a cold metallic sound that made my stomach churn. "It's a perfect match for his signature on the union contracts. When the forensic accountants look at this, Danny is going to look like the greediest bastard in Ohio." I felt the air leave my lungs. He hadn't just framed me. He had orchestrated the entire embezzlement scheme, stealing millions from our father's company to build a cage for me. "Keep rolling," I told Michael, my voice trembling with a mixture of absolute rage and dizzying relief. "Go to October 14th. We scrubbed forward. On the afternoon of the 14th, the camera captured Arthur Pendleton arriving. It showed Dad, lucid and commanding, explicitly directing Arthur to draft the new will, leaving me the company. It captured every word of Dad's disgust with Simon's backroom deals. And crucially, it captured Dad signing the document with his own hand, while Arthur and his paralegal witnessed it. I didn't forge the will. Simon was the one manufacturing evidence. By 9 a.m. the next morning, Michael and I were sitting in Rebecca Hayes' office. When I showed her the footage, the usually stoic attorney dropped her Mont Blanc pen onto her legal pad. She watched the video 3 times in total silence. When she finally looked up, her eyes were sharp, predatory, and gleaming with absolute predatory delight. "Daniel," Rebecca said slowly, a terrifying smile spreading across her face. "In the legal profession, we have very strict rules against trial by ambush. You must turn over all evidence during discovery." My heart sank. "So we just hand this over to Sterling. He'll find a way to suppress it. He'll say the audio is doctored, or the timestamps are altered." "Exactly," Rebecca nodded. "Which is why we aren't submitting this as primary evidence. We are holding it back. When Simon takes the stand, he will testify under oath about the forgery and the embezzlement. The moment he does, this video ceases to be primary evidence and becomes impeachment evidence, evidence used solely to prove a witness is committing perjury. And impeachment evidence, my dear Daniel, does not need to be disclosed before trial." She closed her laptop with a definitive snap. "We are going to let your brother build his own gallows, and then we are going to pull the lever." The Hamilton County Courthouse was a towering structure of limestone and marble, a place where lives were dissected and futures were decided. The trial began in the second week of March. The courtroom was packed. Local journalists filled the gallery, eager for the latest installment of the Fletcher family tragedy. I sat at the defense table next to Rebecca, staring straight ahead. For the first 3 days, Thomas Sterling put on a masterclass in character assassination. He called the forensic accountant, Greg Harrison, who walked the jury through the offshore transfers, pointing to the forged initials as absolute proof of my guilt. He called Maria, the night nurse, who nervously recounted the fabricated story of me screaming at my dying father. Through it all, I didn't flinch. I just waited. On the morning of the 4th day, Sterling called his star witness. The plaintiff calls Simon Fletcher to the stand. Simon walked to the witness box, wearing a bespoke navy suit that probably cost more than a machinist's monthly salary. He raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, and sat down with an expression of profound, manufactured sorrow. Under Sterling's gentle questioning, Simon painted a heartbreaking portrait. He spoke of his love for our father, his dedication to the company, and his utter shock when he discovered my crimes. "I couldn't believe it," Simon said, wiping a perfectly timed tear from his eye. "My own brother. While I was trying to keep our clients from jumping ship during Dad's illness, Daniel was bleeding the company dry. And then, to force a forged will on a dying man, it's unforgivable." "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher," Sterling said sympathetically, returning to his seat. "Your witness?" Rebecca Hayes stood up. She didn't carry any notes. She walked slowly to the center of the courtroom, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "Mr. Fletcher," Rebecca began, her voice calm and conversational, "you have testified that you had no knowledge of the D. Fletcher Holdings account in the Cayman Islands until your accountant discovered it in January, correct?" "That is correct," Simon nodded firmly. "And you have testified, under oath, that you were not present in your father's home office on the night of October 12th? "I was at my own apartment," Simon stated smoothly. "Grieving." And finally, Rebecca paced toward the jury box. "You are absolutely certain that your father's signature on the final will was forged by Daniel, and that Arthur Pendleton was somehow tricked into filing it?" "I am certain," Simon said, narrowing his eyes slightly. "Your Honor," Rebecca pivoted sharply toward the judge, "the defense calls for the introduction of Impeachment Exhibit A, a video and audio recording from a concealed security system located in the late Richard Fletcher's home office." The courtroom erupted into a chaotic murmur. Thomas Sterling shot up from his chair, his face flushed purple. "Objection? Your Honor, this is a blatant ambush. We have never seen this footage. It was not provided in discovery." "Your Honor," Rebecca countered smoothly, raising her voice over the din. "The rules of civil procedure clearly state that evidence used solely for the purpose of impeaching a witness's testimony does not require prior disclosure. Mr. Fletcher has just made several definitive statements under oath. This footage proves he is committing perjury right now in your courtroom." The judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, slammed her gavel. "Order. I will allow the exhibit, Ms. Hayes, but it had better be exactly what you claim it is." Michael Ross, who had been sitting quietly in the back row, stepped forward with his laptop and plugged it into the courtroom's projector system. A large screen descended from the ceiling. The lights dimmed. The grainy, motion-activated footage of October 12th flickered onto the screen. The date and timestamp glowed brightly in the bottom corner. The courtroom was dead silent as the heavy mahogany doors swung open. Simon, wearing the black hoodie, crept into the frame. I watched Thomas Sterling's jaw actually drop. On the screen, Simon inserted the thumb drive, and then the pristine audio echoed through the cavernous courtroom. "The routing numbers are confirmed." Sterling's own voice played from the speakers, tying the lawyer directly to the conspiracy. "I'm initiating the final $3 million wire to the D. Fletcher Holdings account now," Simon's voice answered. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. The jury members leaned forward, their eyes wide with shock. I looked at Simon. All the color had drained from his face. He gripped the edges of the witness stand so hard his knuckles were white. The video continued. It showed Simon pulling out the forged stamp of my initials. "When the forensic accountants look at this, Danny is going to look like the greediest bastard in Ohio." "Turn it off!" Simon suddenly shouted, his composure shattering completely. He stood up in the witness box, pointing frantically at the screen. "That's doctored! It's a deep fake! AI generated! He's trying to frame me!" "Your Honor," Rebecca said, her voice cutting through Simon's panic like a scalpel. "We have the metadata, the original hard drives, and the sworn testimony of the head of corporate security, verifying the authenticity of the air-gapped server. Furthermore, we have a second video." Michael switched the file. The footage from October 14th played, showing Dad, very much alive and lucid, legally signing the will with Arthur Pendleton. The silence that followed the end of the second video was deafening. It was the sound of an empire collapsing on the wrong brother. The judge slowly turned her gaze to Simon, her expression akin to a block of ice. "Mr. Fletcher, you are remanded into the custody of the bailiff. This trial is suspended immediately. I am contacting the district attorney to file charges of perjury, grand larceny, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud." She glared at Thomas Sterling, who was aggressively stuffing papers into his briefcase, looking terrified. "And the DA will be looking very closely at your legal counsel as well." As the bailiffs approached Simon, he didn't fight. He just looked at me, his eyes wide and hollow. The golden boy had finally been tarnished, destroyed by the very things he thought were beneath him, the gritty details, the unglamorous truth, and the quiet vigilance of a father who knew exactly who his sons were. Blood might be thicker than water, but truth is the ultimate solvent. Simon tried to bury me under a mountain of lies, forgetting that our father built things to last, including his security systems. Today, Fletcher Precision is thriving, and the only metal my brother works with are the bars on his cell. Justice wasn't just served, it was manufactured to exact tolerances.